this video, I'll be talking about the protest movements. In this video, I will focus on comparing and contrasting the goals, tactics, success/failures of African American civil rights movement, the feminist movement, and the Chicano movement. All of these movements had similarities. One, to create opportunities for minority groups that did not have equal as majority groups, to eliminate equality and discrimination. They also use similar tactics and strategies to advance their movements, such as legal actions, protests, violence, etc. And these movements all took place in a long period of time. The feminist movement in the United States dates back to the 1840s and is still going on today, though in somewhat low intensities. The struggle of the civil rights movement never really had a start or an end. It started with the rise of the end of slavery in the 1830s and is still continuing to the present time, which has evolved into the Black Lives Matter movement, while the Chicano movement was primarily in the 1860s and early 70s. The civil rights movement wanted to end, end segregation, desegregate schools and other public facilities. They wanted access to job and housing, and they wanted to reverse the idea of separate but equal. And they honestly just wanted equality in general. Some of the tactics that were used in this movement were sit-ins, which are non-violent protests in which black and whites attempt to desegregate lunch counters by sitting at a counter until served, but by doing this, they were met with violence, humiliation, and vulgarity. White customers and store owners would curse, spit, and even attack some of the protesters. Boycotting was also used in this movement. Boycotting is intentionally refusing to or pay for something. Nonviolent protest was also something that was used in this movement. This strategy was developed by Gandhi in India, and it's basically the idea of refusing to fight back when conflicted with a violence. Martin Luther King also promoted this idea. Marching was also something that African Americans used in the civil rights movement. They would march around to bring attention to an injustice. Salem to Montgomery marches. This was a march led by Martin Luther King, one of the biggest civil rights leaders. He led the march from Salem to the state capital of Alabama, Montgomery. And the purpose of this was to focus on the efforts to register Black voters in the South. This helped bring awareness to the difficulties faced by Black voters in the South and the need for a Voting Right Act, which was later passed that year. Montgomery Bus Riot, 1955. This was an attempt to desegregate the bus systems after Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white man. She was later then arrested. She was seated in front of the colored section. When all the seats of the white section was filled, the driver asked her to get up and give up her seat, but she refused to. After her being arrested, it led to a big boycott and resulted with the United States Supreme Court ruling that segregation on public buses were unconstitutional. Some successes of the African American Civil Rights Movement are the Civil Rights Act of 1965, which ended discrimination based on race, religion, national origin, and gender. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, which eliminated the literacy test and any other factors that kept blacks from voting in the South. And a failure, I would say, that came from the African American Civil Rights Movement was that discrimination still lied in America. Since it was a new thing, it was hard to regulate and stop discrimination and segregation from still happening. Goals of the feminist movement were to change how society felt about the feminist theory. They wanted better jobs and equal pay. The leaders of the feminine movement believed that women should have the freedom and safe access to legal abortion. They felt like they should be able to make this decision on their own without the interference of state, government, or medical professionals. Middle class suburban housewives downplayed the importance of women's education, and so feminists knew that girls must be encouraged to seek an education and not just look at education as something to fall back on. Some of the tactics that the feminist movement used were lobbying, petitions, pageants, picketing, and parades. The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan explored the unhappiness of the mid-20th century woman. She described the woman's unhappiness as a problem that has no name. Betty broke a new ground by exploring the ideas of women finding personal fulfillment outside of their traditional roles. Miss America protest of 1968. The Miss America pageant had hundreds of feminist activists protesting the pageant. These protesters believed that women were judged on impossible standards of beauty, calling these standards ludicrous. They believed that objectifying women in this way was harming them. The slogans that were called during this pageant was one of them was a cattle auction. They believed this because the way that women were being paraded around to judges was the same way that men would judge cattle to decide the animal's worth. The protesters also nominated a live sheep for Mrs. America and even crowned the sheep on Broadway. As the pageant was taking place, feminists marched around a freedom trash can and tossed items they perceived as symbols of feminine oppression, such as high heels, makeup, girdles, and bras. Some successes of the feminist movement were that working conditions and wages became better for women, the FDA would approve birth control, and women would be in politics. Failures of the feminist movement were that women were still not equal to men in some aspects, and that women were not able to own sole ownership of a property. Goals of the Chicano movement included education reform. Hispanic students were often placed in segregated schools and dealt with unfair practices. Voting, voting and political rights. Hispanic Americans were often segregated and persecuted as African Americans had been. Rights of farm workers. The USA allowed Mexicans to work in the United States during the World War II. However, after the war, employers were supposed to give preference to the United States citizens. But most employers continued to use Mexican workers because they could pay them low wages, make them work long hours without a break, and mistreat them. They were also denied the ability to become citizens. Restoration of land. A group of Mexicans attempted to reclaim federal land in the United States. This group based their action on the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which was signed by the United States and Mexico in 1848 to end the Mexican War. The treaty promised that Mexican the treaty promised Mexican lands to United States and ensured that the landowner Mexicans would keep their pre-existing properties in the land transferred. The United States failed to honor the part of the agreement as it did not recognize Mexican original land grants. Because of this, many Mexicans lost their lands. Some tactics used in the Chicano movement were walkouts, protests, sit-ins, and riots. East LA walkout 1964. The Mexican American community had the highest dropout rate and the lowest college acceptance among any ethnic group. Students were forbidden from speaking Spanish in class or using restrooms during lunchtime. Schools taught a curriculum that largely ignored or denied Mexican American history and Chicana. In 1968, the students decided to take actions into their own hands and staged a walkout in schools across LA. Many many date the modern Chicano movement to the walkout when some 20,000 students took the streets. African civil rights movement, feminist movement, and the Chicana movement are all movements that have similar aspects to them, but it's their differences that set them apart from